Hi everybody, it's time, it's happening. It's 3 o'clock and it's time for another How to Start Stargazing. I'm really excited. For those of you who are watching for the first time and not watching from the start of the series, and maybe this is the first time you've ever seen me, I'm Dr. Kevin Hainline. I'm an astronomer who lives in Tucson, Arizona. I work at the University of Arizona, and I also am a person who really enjoys stargazing, and so I've started this series to show people about how to stargaze, how to familiarize themselves with the night sky and the constellations, how to use a star map, how to view things like the moon and the phases of the moon, understand how the constellations change, mostly just to familiarize yourself with the night sky. I started this last year because in COVID, people were kind of feeling a little isolated. I know I was. And I wanted something to remind people that, you know, the night sky was something that was for everybody. And that was something that you could go outside and see even from your backyard, wherever you live around the world. Unless you live someplace where it's constantly cloudy, or you live like right smack dab in the middle of Manhattan or something like that. You generally have access to a night sky. It's not a huge difficult thing to get out of town to be able to see it. So the way that these normally work is that we start off by looking at what the night sky looks like tonight and what it'll look like for the next couple of weeks. We look at the sky map, we kind of see what we can see, what's of interest, and then we go into kind of a topic. And today's topic is buying a telescope. So we're going to talk most of our time today about telescope buying. And if you have questions, as always, if you're watching this live, just pop it in the chat comments here, or if you are watching this on YouTube, just make a YouTube comment and I'll try to answer it. Although most comments are just recognition from videos I've made in the past, which is also very nice. So let's get started. Here we are once again in this beautiful field that Stellarium kind of builds up here. And again, if you want to know this piece of software that I use it's called Stellarium. It's free. There's a web version that you can just use in Chrome in the browser. This is the standalone version, Stellarium. And it's a piece of software that I absolutely love because it allows you to put yourself all over the world. As you can see here, if I have a location window, I can change the location anywhere in the world, although right now I keep it at Tucson, where I currently live. Last month, we looked at the Southern Hemisphere sky, so we just popped ourselves down in the Southern Hemisphere, so it's pretty cool. And then also I can change the date and time, so I can put it at different dates and times, so we can look at what it would look like, you know, when the day you were born, right? Which is kind of a cool thing. If you want to know what stars were above right at the time you were born, cool way of looking at. And then there's also a lot of other stuff here, including you've seen different perspectives that we can do, so if you ever wanted to look at this in a different way of looking at the sky, although I like this stereographic. And then you can change stuff in terms of labels, and I'm going to turn off some labels here. This is something I always have to do at the beginning because I don't like when you see the labels on there because it kind of ruins some of the experience of using this. But there's also deep sky objects and various markings you can put on, you know, as well as different, you know, like so here we can have Großmügel here, which is shows Vienna in the distance, right? Grande Barachoise, which is kind of a nice Canadian view, although you got to watch out because there are lots of trees in the way. Geneva, just the horizon line, not a super exciting one there. But we could also go and land on Mars. This is what it would look like from the surface of Mars if we were there, except the sky is not really blue on Mars. It's a slightly redder, ruddier color. Or on the moon, where the sky is also definitely not blue. And then you can have zero horizon, which is just the most boring version, But I really like to do Guerin's here because I think this field is very pretty. And then we've got star lore, and this is something where we can look at different constellations from different cultures. I usually keep it in Western or Western HA ray. I'll start with Western HA ray, which is based on this book, The Stars, A New Way to See Them. So I just wanted to start that way because every time I start these, I always forget that I need to turn those off, and I was just reminding myself that I need to do it. But again, this program is free, it's open source, and I really, really like it, so I recommend that you go and look at it, pick it up. So our first thing is, well, right now this is, current time, which for me is a little after 3, so we're using military time down here, which is 15:04. And this is where the sun is at this time of year. If we kind of zoom out, which is really hard to do, you can see that, like, if we put north up at the very top here, put north right up at the very top, you can see that that at this time of year, this is really hard to do because gimbal, the sun is going to rise over here in the east and then go across to the west. Actually, we can really show exactly where it goes. And you can see where the sun rises a little northeast, then goes across and sets a little northwest, right? And this is because we're in the summer. right? If we were in the winter, as we saw last, like months ago, the sun would rise in the southeast and then go across. This is a lot shorter of a day. It's a shorter trip across this way than like making this entire journey across like this. We'll put it right here, and we can kind of zoom back in. And so this is where the sun is right now. So when it's going to set a little bit north of west. So, west northwest, I guess, because we're in the northern hemisphere. You're getting closer to the summer, and so the Earth is tilted a little bit towards the sun, which means our day's a little longer, and the sun travels a little bit higher in the sky than the low along the horizon near the winter. And so let's let time go on, and we'll let the sun set. And you can see that the sun, you're probably noticing yourself that the sun is setting later and later. It might be a little weird for most of you, actually, I should remember. In Arizona, we don't abide by daylight saving time. So most people, turn that clock forward or backwards. But most of Arizona doesn't do that, which is great because it means I don't have to worry about losing an hour of sleep, once a year and then gaining an extra hour of sleep later. It's not, we don't play that little game. But for most people, time was the sun setting was making regular changes, and then suddenly the hour was different, so maybe a little bit weird for you. But for me, the sun has been setting later and later and later in the night, and so you can see right now that for me right now, this is 6 o'clock, and then we're getting towards 7 o'clock, and the sun is fully set around 7 o'clock right here. Whereas in the winter the sun was setting by 5:36 o'clock. Now it's going to 7, and by the time the summer really gets closer and closer as we get to June and July, it'll be even later. And so right as the sun sets, we have twilight, and then we get to a really nice dark sky around 8 o'clock, 8:30. I like starting here at 8:30. We know the sun is set in the west, which sets all the rest of the 4 cardinal directions. If we were to turn 90 degrees to the right, we would get north again. 90 degrees to the right from this, east. 90 degrees from the right from that is south, right? So once you know where the sun has set, and you know that you're, what time of year, so you can kind of adjust for that, right? So instead of the sun set here, I know it's probably a little bit to the right of west. Here's where west is, here's where north is. And once you start kind of getting the general sense of where north, south, east, and west is, at that point you can start going, all right, what is the actual north, south, east, and west? And remember, we've discussed this every month. The best way of doing that is using the Big Dipper. So start that way, as I always do when I go outside at night. Unless I kind of see something that I know, I see that, presumably right now at 8:30, you're probably seeing something maybe we've seen quite a bit in the winter that is actually getting harder and harder to see because the sun has just set and it's pretty low on the horizon when the sun sets, meaning it's not going to stick around very long, which is Orion here. So you can all see Orion right here, the hunter, head, shoulders, knees, and toes. And this is a winter constellation. And in the spring, it means that if you want to see it, you got to go out right after the sun has set, right? But if we start here, right where the sun set, you can see Orion. If we turn 90 degrees to the right, we can start looking to see if we can find the North Star. Now, I know where the North Star is because you can see north and you find it, but if you want to find it, remember, we can find the Big Dipper, which is up here at the top of the screen, right? Here's the bucket, and here's the handle, and right now this is a great time to see the Big Dipper. We look for the 2 stars, Doobie and Merak, in the bucket, and they point right towards the North Star, just like that. And so that shows you, boom, there's the North Star. Now, in this software, it really makes the North Star seem brighter. But as many people have pointed out to me when they're outside at night, they always thought that the North Star would be much, much brighter. But it turns out the North Star is not as bright as some other stars. For instance, there are many stars over here that are much brighter. This star right here, the brightest star in the sky, is really, really bright. It's just, kind of an average, a little bit brighter than normal star. Pretty obvious to see if you're out and you find it with the Big Dipper here. But we use these 2 bucket stars to point there, Doobie and Merak. And so this is a good time of year because, at this time of night, right after the sun is set, the Big Dipper is pretty high in the sky. There are other times of the year where the Big Dipper is way down here near the horizon. And if you live farther south than I do, let's say you live in Mexico, Central America, there are times of the year where when you live that far south towards the equator, this star moves farther down towards the horizon because the distance, the altitude we call it, we'll come back to that term a little bit later, the altitude between the horizon and the North Star is your latitude. And so if you live at a latitude of 0, which is on the equator, then the distance in degrees between this star is 0. So on the equator, the North Star is not really easily seen because the North Pole of the Earth, you can imagine living on a ball, the North Pole of the Earth points to the star, you're living up on the very, very edge here. It'd be really hard to see the North Star because while it's very far away, it's right along the horizon. And similarly, if we all took a trip to the North Pole, if you live very far north, then this star is actually even farther up. And so at the North Pole, this star is like directly above us in a place that we call the zenith. And we talked about that in the past, but I'd just like to remind you that that means things have changed. But what's great is that generally in the Northern Hemisphere right now, right after sunset, it's a great time to see the Big Dipper. And if you haven't gone outside at night and looked, I urge you every month I do this, to go outside and actually use some of the skills we've done. I haven't heard from anybody who's actually gone out and done it, so I assume maybe they have and they just aren't very talkative to me, which is fine. But if you have, let me know. Write a comment. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I'm not just yammering off into the ether. But in this case, what you've got here is the Big Dipper, which is a great way to start because it guides us here. And then also, as we've been talking in the last couple weeks, we can take the Big Dipper here and we can use it to find some other stuff. We can arc over here to Arcturus. We can speed on here to Spica, and between that and this, like on this line right now, is which is right here. Well, as we were seeing right at the beginning, is the moon, and the moon is actually very close to being full. It'll be full in the next day or so. I think it's full either tomorrow or the next day, but it's pretty close to being full, and so this may not be the best time for really deep sky observing, but it's a great time to go outside and look because you can still see some bright stuff, and the moon will help you find Spica here. Spica's not super easy unless you use this trick to speed on to Spica after arcing to Arcturus here. Some people say spike to Spica, but I don't like that. I don't know what spike, like it doesn't, it's not really a verb you use very often unless you're talking about volleyball, whatever. But you arc and speed right on there to Spica, right? And so Arcturus is in the constellation of Bootes, the shepherd. We've talked about this in the past. It's right here. It looks like an ice cream cone. It has this little V, which is the cone, and then the ice cream is on the top here. But it's actually a shepherd. And if I turn on my art, my lines here, you can see that H.A. Ray drew this shepherd. He's on his back right now, but this is his head. He's wearing a little hat. He's got this long, like, Lord of the Rings pipe here, little foot coming down here. But this is Bootes, B-O-O-T-E-S, and the O has a little umlaut. The first O has an umlaut, so it's Botes, or Bootes. And Bootes is the shepherd. And Arcturus here means bear watcher because it's watching the bear constellation right here, and the bear and the shepherd are kind of having a conversation, I guess. Next to it, Spica is part of Virgo, the Virgin, one of the zodiac constellations. In fact, my zodiacal sign is Virgo. So the sun was hypothetically in the constellation of Virgo when I was born, even though it wasn't, because it turns out the constellations that dictate the zodiac are off by a month or around a month because of weird calendar stuff, so I don't want to get into it. But this is a little bit harder to see. We've talked about it in the past, but if I turn the art on here, the lines, you can see that it's this woman. She's got a really big diamond-shaped head here, a hand. She's got like a, little skirt on or something with these legs here. This is just, but you can see there's not a lot of really bright stars there. You can kind of see the legs, and the head over here. But you have to have some pretty good vision. And right now, because the moon is so bright in this part of the sky, it's probably going to be really hard to see all of the stars in this. So you'll most likely just see Spica. And then we talked about this last time, but next to Spica and the moon right now is Corvus the crow. We have Hydra the snake. We have Crater the cup, which is right here. I'm pretty sure this is the cup next to the crow. And if I turn on my constellation lines right now, you see, yeah, there's the cup, there's the crow, here's the snake, Hydra. These are your kind of classic start of spring constellations. And I like to just reiterate this so that you have another opportunity to see these and start seeing their patterns, right? Like Corvus the crow is something you can actually go out and see. There's, 4 bright stars in this kind of, specific, like with the tail coming down here and the head coming over here. This is something that you're going to look in the southeast sky. Generally, go find the moon. Pretty straightforward to find the moon tonight. And look a little bit to the right of the moon, a little bit more towards the south from the moon. You'll see both Spica, and then next to Spica, you'll see Corvus. If you can see that, pat yourself on the back. That's a constellation most people are not familiar with. They're not a lot of Corvus heads out there. I am a Corvus head. I think Corvus is a great constellation, really fun. And in the spring, there's not much to look at. So now that we've oriented ourselves and we found a couple things, right? We've found the Big Dipper, which is part of Ursa Major. We've arced over here to Arcturus and found the ice cream cone of Bootes. We've gone over to Spica and then maybe kind of seen Virgo, although the moon's pretty bright. We've seen Corvus. Now we can start doing some fun stuff. Let's pull out our sky maps. So I will put the sky map out here. And here's our sky map. And so the game is, can we see what we were just seeing there with the sky map? So if I pull up the sky map here, now I can put my mouse over it so you can see where my mouse is. We were just looking at the Big Dipper here, and then we were arcing to Arcturus, speeding on here to Spica. The moon was over in this part of the sky. The moon is going to be somewhere near this dashed line called the ecliptic, because that's the plane of our solar system, and the moon kind of exists in the plane of the solar system. It's not significantly tilted out of that. And so most all the planets and stars are going to be along that line. But we've arced to Arcturus, sped on here to Spica. We've looked to the right of Spica and seen Corvus, remember south, southeast down here, and Crater, the Cup, and Hydra. And so now, whenever we do this every month, we start by looking at what is the new constellations over here near the east. And it turns out there's not a lot of great new constellations. There's a bunch of really good stuff here, right? Orion was setting, and Canis Major. We talked about Gemini and the Charioteer and all these. But the spring doesn't bring a lot of great constellations. In fact, there's a big chunk of sky down here where there's not a huge number of really important constellations that we generally give, like, they're really bright. There's some, stars there, but they're not associated with, like, very bright constellations. It's kind of a bummer. There's a couple things that we can look for. First off, let's look towards the northeast and see if we can see this bright star Vega, which you might remember from last year. We've actually next month will be the 11th one of these, but essentially the 12th month, because I combined 2 months into one video. So we'll have done an entire year next month. And I'm wondering if next month it might be the last one that I do, because then it'll be a whole year of looking at the stars. But we'll see. But, Vega you might remember from last year, because it was really, really prominent, and it's part of the summer triangle. So it's helping us get excited about the fact that summer's coming. But also let's look for Hercules right now as well. And the Hercules has a couple things in it that we want to talk about as well. But let's look and see. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, all right, what I want is I want to look towards the northeast. So if I know where north is, and I do a 90 degrees turn to the right, then I will be able to see east. So if I look halfway between them, hopefully I'll find Lyra and Vega. And then if I want to look between that and east, I can hopefully find Hercules. So let's actually see if we can see that. So if we turn the sky map off, and we go back here, and we go look at north. So here's north, I do 90 degrees, now I'm in east, and I look over here, and it doesn't look like I can see Vega yet. Let's make time go on a little bit longer. Aha! Sure enough, right after I say that, click on it, whoops, we get a satellite, and there's Vega, and the constellation of Lyra the Liar, which is not a great constellation. If I turn my constellation lines on, you can see that it's just kind of this thing that's kind of about to rise, and this is H.A. Ray's version where he kind of makes it sort of look like an actual stringed instrument. But this is what we thought, and so now if we want to look here, we can hopefully see Hercules, which is up somewhere in here. Now, Hercules is not a really easy to see constellation. There's not a lot of very bright stars. I'm going to turn off these things like that, because meteor showers are exciting, but we're not talking about those right now. So what we want to do is we want to see if we can see this right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my sky map on yet again. And this time I'm actually going to do something where I zoom in. So let's drop this down. Drop this down. Let's rotate this. Transform, rotate 90 degrees counterclockwise. Yeah, let's really make it bigger. So what we want is we want to look to see here. We want to look to see, can we see this kind of box here? Can we see any of these things? Can we see maybe Alpha Hercules, which is down here? And it's going to be a little hard to see, but the way we may want to do it is go, okay, well, Vega, if we look just kind of straight up from Vega, we'll see one of the stars at least, hopefully. And maybe we can start tracing out the shape that way. This is a tough thing to do. Maybe what we'll do is also look for Corona Borealis here, which is going to be under Bootes. So we know where Bootes, we found Bootes. If we look under Bootes, we can see Corona Borealis, and maybe we can look down and see if we can find Alpha from that. Maybe let's do that. So turn the sky map off. We go back up here. And so we go, all right, well, let's see. Here's our arc to Arcturus. So there's Arcturus. Here's Bootes, the shepherd. And we're going to look under. There's Corona Borealis. Can you see this curve, this backward C of the northern crown? And so then if we look down, we want to find maybe the bright star. What about you? Are you the bright star? Are you Alpha? No, you're K Ophiuchus. What about you? Beta Hercules. What about you? Alpha Ser. We found, so it's around here somewhere. I'm not seeing it directly. Here's Alpha Corona, the brightest star in the crown. Maybe it hasn't risen yet. Are you it? Alpha Ophiuchus. What if we go a little bit longer? Are you it? Cave. Let's turn on our lines. Alpha 1. Oh, it's this. It's not even the bright one. So here we're seeing, this is a different drawing of Hercules, the same stars, but you're seeing Hercules down here, right? With the club, the head, the arm, legs. If we go change our star lore to Western, you can see the version that's essentially like the one I was just showing you. Like if I turn my sky map on, it's more closely aligned to this, right? Can you see this now? Except it has a lot bigger of a, you know, head over here. You know, if you go between the two of them there. And that's because, again, as I say, every week or every month, it is not the way you draw the lines between the stars that dictates the constellation. It's just some area in the sky. You can connect the dots any way you want. But here is the brightest stars. If I turn my constellation lines back off here, maybe this is the bright central 4 that we're going to want to see with some other ones up here. And that might be the brightest thing you can see. So the way we'd find that is we look for booties, the ice cream cone, look beneath it, and you'll see the curve here. And then if we look right beneath it again, we see these 4 stars, which are the brightest part of Hercules. This is what I generally tend to look for, right? If we go a little bit farther down, you know, so if we go between the brightest star in the crown and Vega here, it goes right in the middle of this Hercules square here. And if I turn the lines back on, you can see, well, this is a gross one. Let's turn on the other HA Ray star lore, which is kind of a fun one. This would be the head then. And so the club is above here, and the arm goes out, bright leg, another leg comes down there, right? And over here on the left, you know, another thing we've talked about in the past, but remember, if we come down here and look at the northern star, right, Doobie and Merak pointing down, I guess I have to move my head away from the northern star, which is the northern star. It's right. Oh, my chair's in the way. Here, I know what I'll do. Bye. The northern star, which is down here, then we can also trace our way up here, and then between the two, between the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper down here, because we trace this up for the Little Dipper, there's the Little Dipper's bucket, and then there's the handle. We can trace this up, and you actually end up getting this Draco the dragon, and this is the head of Draco the dragon, which looks like a little kite down here. Pretty cool. And so that's kind of the things we can do right now. Not a huge amount of exciting stuff. If you can find Hercules, you get super bonus points. But remember, Hercules is kind of looking, you know, like at Vega, the bright star of Lyra the Liar. And right above the head is that square again of Hercules, the head of Hercules, right? You could imagine the club above here and, you know, an arm coming out this way, maybe a leg. You got to have some good imagination for these things, right? And the crown, Corona Borealis, and then above it is, right here, is the ice cream cone, the head of Booties the shepherd. Pretty cool. So the question is, when is it, you know, like is that really it? Well, there's lots of other things, and you could imagine looking at some other stuff. If we turn on some other lines here, you can see that we actually started to see something down here that's really exciting. And if you were to come out really late at night, you know, like, so we go out, this is 11 o'clock right now, and maybe if you come out at midnight, you start to see some really cool summer things, including this right here, which is one of the great summer constellations of the Scorpion. There's the eye of the Scorpion, which is called Antares, which means rival of Mars. If I click on this, you see Antares. And the tail comes down here. This is the pincer on the tail down here. And the claws are this way. This is a great summer constellation. So you're starting to get some more exciting constellations. If I turn on more of the art, you can see that now more of the summer triangle is starting to be visible. 1, 2, 3, right there, the summer triangle, right? If I turn the art back off, you can see the summer triangle. And then when I kept saying Ophiuchus, this is Ophiuchus right here, the snake handler, and this is another thing. We'll talk about this again next month. We talked about it last year in our first couple months of video, but those will be things I'll talk about next year. But, you know, it depends on how late you are out. You know, if you really want to be out, eager beaver, you can be out pretty late. And, you know, if I go, like, you know, to 3 or 4 in the morning, you can start to see some cool stuff, including Saturn and Jupiter. Which are still visible. You just got to be up at like 3 or 4 in the morning. Why does that matter? Well, it turns out maybe you don't just want to do what we call naked eye astronomy. Maybe you've done a year of this and you're familiar with the constellations and you're really excited about this and you're like, you know what I would love? I would love to be able to look at these things. I'd love to be able to look at Saturn and Jupiter in a better way, right? And so if I like zoom in and magnify this, you'd be like, oh man, I would love to be able to see this with my eye. And to do that, you can't just do that with your eyes. Unless you have really amazing robot eyes, you're going to need a telescope. And so the rest of this episode, I want to talk about telescopes. I want to talk about why you might want a telescope and what you should think about when you're buying a telescope, and what are some of the aspects of buying a telescope. And this is for the absolute beginner. There's going to be some stuff in here that if you already have a telescope or you're familiar with telescopes, you're going to be like, I already know that. And that's fine. But if you're someone who just is like, and I get this all the time, people saying, you know what, I really wish that I had a telescope. Which telescope should I buy? And the answer to that question is, well, that depends. All right, so first off, let's talk about telescopes. What is a telescope? And I've talked about this in other videos that I've made, but a telescope is essentially an object that takes part of the sky and it makes it smaller so that it looks like it's larger in your eye. It like takes a large chunk of the sky, or like something zoomed in, and like magnifies it for your eye, right? And it acts using what we call like a focusing mechanism, and either the focusing mechanism is glass or a mirror, and it focuses onto another eyepiece, which then takes it so that your eye can see it as larger in the sky. And so often when you buy telescopes, they'll advertise themselves on magnification, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's kind of a way to think about this, which is that a telescope allows us to magnify a chunk of the sky so that we can see it better, closer, right? Just like a magnifying lens magnifies like something you're looking at down here, a telescope acts to magnify a chunk of the sky for you. For instance, if you wanted to look at Saturn, you'd want a telescope that takes this thing that, for here, like if I look here, you can see that, right, like through, this, you can kind of barely see that it has rings, but if I magnified it more, you'd see better, right? And if I magnified it even more, you'd love it if you had a telescope that allowed you to do that. Now notice also these things are motoring. That'll come into play a little bit later. We'll talk about that as well, right? So with your naked eye, you can just barely see, like you can see, not barely, you can see these bright objects. But with a telescope, with binoculars, you can probably see the objects a little bit better, like, as fuzzy blobs. Sometimes you can see with a telescope that they're fuzzy blobs with some other dots around them, which are the moons, which is kind of cool, right? Like you can see here, with my binoculars, I can see that it's a fuzzy blob with some other dots. Like that's kind of what it looks like with binoculars. But with a telescope, you can maybe do better. So, how do telescopes work? Well, there's multiple types of telescopes, right? And let's talk about your kind of classic telescope, the one that you're going to see the most when you think about looking at telescopes. The most obvious telescope you look at is this looking one, right? This is your stereotypical telescope, and you're here in like an optics telescope store, blurred out. Then this will just sitting on the ground here, and then we've got some numbers over here. But like essentially a telescope is an object where light comes into this way, as you might expect, and then it goes through some magic in this bucket, and then comes out this little eyepiece down here, and it's magnified, right? And what it's doing is, inside of this telescope, there is an object up here. In this telescope, it's a piece of glass that's a lens, and the lens is making the light go in and focus down to a mirror here, and then it goes into another eyepiece here, which has another little lens that unfocuses it, therefore your eye can see it. But it takes the object, and magnifies it, uses these two eyepieces to magnify the view of what you're seeing to your eye, right? If I look at this in another way, we can look at this object here. This is a classic, whoops, let's turn off this internet image here. This is a refracting telescope, this type of telescope. Or sorry, that's a reflector telescope. I don't know why, that's not what I wanted. I wanted refracting. Where's my refracting telescope? Here we are. This is it. Yep. Refracting telescope. So you can see, as we do the cutaway, you can see the large lens here, right? Another mirror here, and then a couple more lenses on the other side. So light comes in, it's focused down, and then unfocused essentially for your eye right there, right? So once again, this is just your classic refractor telescope. It's called refractor because the word refract is just the word we use for when light enters a different medium, it bends. So when light enters glass, it actually goes at a different speed, and it slowly bends in a direction, and you know this because you've probably looked at light through things like prisms and stuff, and other, you've used magnifying lenses, which do that. You could also imagine that this doesn't have a mirror here, that this is just straight and you're just looking through the bottom of the telescope. But generally, for ease of use, we have these little right angle mirrors, which allow you to see this at an angle, right? So that's one type of telescope. And to go back to our image here, There's also other parts of the telescope besides the tube here, which is the real telescope, and then the eyepiece right here. There's the mount, which is this thing down here that's labeled 4, right? There's the, I guess, the 3 and 4. 3 is the mount, and 4 is the tripod that it's on. So the mount, which is the way that it's actually mounted. There's also a finder scope sometimes. There's eyepieces here. There's focusing knobs. There's other knobs over here which control the motion of the telescope. And these are important things that you should be looking, you should understand before you even think about buying a telescope. But this is essentially, all this works together to do the one basic thing, which is take a part of the sky and allow it to be focused so that your eye can see it and it looks magnified, right? So there are 2 other types of telescopes that are generally in popular use. One of them is a reflecting telescope, which is what I accidentally showed you a little bit ago. And one is called like a compound telescope. Sometimes the Schmidt-Cassegrain is a type of a compound telescope, which uses kind of both worlds there. So let's look at the reflecting telescope, and we'll talk about why you might want this versus another in a little bit. But if we look at the reflecting telescope, this is a classic reflecting telescope. It uses a mirror for focusing. So instead of a piece of glass where light passes through the glass, light bounces off the mirror to a secondary mirror here and onto your eye. So it goes off this, and this thing has to be really perfectly put into an exact spot. There's these little knobs here which move it around so that you can get it exact, so that it can reflect the light from the exact focal point right up onto your eye. Pretty cool. And then there is your kind of compound telescope. This one here, light comes in through here, bounces off this mirror, off of another mirror, and back in through, so that you can kind of essentially have the benefits of a refracting telescope, but in a shorter body. You don't have to have such a long body because you have to get the light, has to focus all the way down. Instead, it folds the refracting, but still it gets, this thing gets in the way, right? But light comes in, bounces off again, and through. So you can see the light path here goes through, bounces back off, once again bounces off through, off the foldable mirror into the eyepiece. All 3 of these telescopes have an eyepiece at the end, right? All 3 of these telescopes need to take the light and unfocus it for your eye, and that eyepiece is pretty important. We'll talk about that in a second. So the thing is that generally, the telescopes you're most likely going to see in, for cheap are going to be your refracting telescopes. These are fairly small on average because, we'll talk about in a second why it's hard to make them bigger. But these are the ones that most people, when they think about a telescope, they think about buying one of these. And the thing about buying a telescope, your number one rule is that telescopes are expensive. If you buy a cheap telescope, it is going to be a bad telescope for many reasons. And you don't want to buy a cheap bad telescope because it will not help you. If you want to spend less money, buy a pair of nice binoculars. Buy a pair of really high-powered binoculars. I've talked about this in the past, but those offer a lot of the same fun. Looking at the moon through binoculars is fantastic. Looking at Mars, or looking at planets through binoculars, you can't really resolve them the same way you can in a telescope, but it's a much easier, you can throw them in a backpack, a pair of binoculars, transport them around. They're more rugged. They can also be used to look at a bunch of stuff on the ground. They're wonderful if you're out camping and you want something that's much easier to transport. Especially because, maybe you only have something like $150, to spend on a telescope. And you're going to be like, well, maybe I'll just buy a cheap one. If you buy a cheap one, it'll be a bad one. Especially ones you're going to just buy like for cheap on Amazon or something like that. They're going to be like this. They're going to be small. They're going to have really terrible mounts. They're going to have really horrible tripods that are going to be built on. So they're going to be shaky. They're going to have bad glass, bad optics. It's just going to be not a good time. So what that means is if you want a telescope, you're going to have to be ready to spend some money. Now, I'm not saying spend as much money as you can. I'm not saying spend, I'm saying that when people ask me what type of telescope to get, it mostly comes down to what's their budget. You can get pretty good telescopes for $300, $400, $500. You could probably even get an okay telescope for $200. But the more you're willing to spend, the better you're able to buy better glass for it, or better mirrors for it, a larger telescope, a better mount, maybe a mount that allows for some computerization. And we'll talk about all this in a little bit. But these are all things that money, is required for these, okay? So if you want a telescope, be ready to spend some money, right? Or be ready to have someone who's got money who can buy you one for Christmas or for a, birthday or something. Because they do cost a little bit of money, right? And also, unlike binoculars, they are something that it is not super straightforward to just pull out and use. Binoculars are great. You pop the lens caps off and you find the thing you're looking for. Generally, some binoculars have larger fields of view, meaning it's pretty easy to find the thing you're looking for. Telescopes require a lot of fiddling. They're not something that, you see movies where they just stick a telescope in a window and then you look through the telescope at space. First off, you probably would never want to use a telescope inside of your room because you're going to need it really dark, and you don't want to have an extra piece of glass between you and the thing you care about, and you're really going to want to do it in your backyard, if anything, or you're going to want to take it out someplace where it's darker. And then secondly, it's not something where you can just have a telescope sitting somewhere and you just go like, oh, I'll find the thing I want. Like, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have some place where you very deliberately set it up in a very deliberate position and direction. Everything is oriented and calibrated, and you go through all of the stuff. That's just a lot of stuff you want to do before the sun has set. Telescopes are fiddly. That being said, they can be very, very rewarding. Okay, so I'm not trying to dissuade you from getting a telescope. I'm just saying before you get a telescope, really do a lot of thinking about what's your budget. What type of telescope do you want? What type of things do you want to look at, right? So the reason that I say that these are kind of good introductory telescopes is because generally these are the ones that are pretty straightforward to set up. You just need a pretty nice, like the telescope has to have a nice piece of glass here to focus. But there's some definite caveats with these types of telescopes. First off, the main thing with the telescope in terms of how good it is how big it is, which we call the aperture, which is essentially how big around is the large, refracting or reflecting element. So, you could think of it how big around is the telescope, right? So smaller aperture, larger aperture. And with glass like this, that's doing the refracting, like in a refracting telescope, you can't make it much, much larger because then it gets heavier and harder to hold. And so generally, these type of telescopes, they don't make them much larger than, say this big. Because at a certain point, it's much easier to ground a mirror and use a reflecting telescope. So the larger telescopes you'll see, they're going to be reflecting telescopes, kind of like this one right here, right? Or they might be compound telescopes, which also use a mirror like that. But refracting telescopes, generally are their specific type. The other thing is that refracting telescopes have a problem, which is that glass, if you've ever used a prism, I'm holding a prism right here, you know that prisms, like the light that goes through a prism, becomes a rainbow. That's because glass affects light of different wavelengths differently. Red light bends differently than the blue light, than the yellow light, than the green light. And that right there causes what's called chromatic aberration, which means that the light, when you look at like the moon, the edge of the moon will look like a little rainbow. And with cheapy telescopes, they don't correct for this at all or account for this. So you just get these really weird rainbow effects on objects because you're using cheapy glass, and the cheap glass is not, it's just spreading the light out at different colors. There are telescopes that use fancier lenses that try to correct for this, but we won't go into that, and that just costs extra money. Okay. But let's talk about. Let's turn off this internet right here. Whoops. Excuse me. Let's talk about telescopes now that we've talked about the types of telescopes. I just mentioned that a telescope is mostly dictated by its, I'm going to sneeze right now. Excuse me. Mostly dictated by its aperture, the size of the circle, of the main focusing element, right? And generally they'll give it in terms of millimeters or inches. So you'll see a telescope that'll say like, it's a 2.8 inch telescope or a 70 millimeter telescope, right? And that'll allow you to compare, right? You'll say, okay, I want one that's pretty big. So, I think, like generally most telescopes you end up seeing are 3, 4, 5 inches across, but they get more expensive. You can definitely get 10-inch telescopes, but those are pretty pricey. The telescopes that I use professionally are meters across, so they're much larger. And the JWST, the telescope that I'm working on as part of my job, is 6.5 meters across. That tells you how big they are when they become professional. But for the amateur, for the regular person who's using a telescope, you want to maybe try and find your first telescope. If you could aim for something 4, 5, or 6 inches, you're going to be in pretty good company. That's a pretty good shape. Okay. The larger the aperture, the more impressive an object will look because you're collecting more light. Every second, more light is falling in and getting focused to your eye, which means that objects, when they're magnified, still look bright. You've got to think about something magnified not being like imagine that you have only a certain amount of paint, and you can paint with that certain amount of paint a little picture of something, or you can paint a big picture, but the paint won't nearly be as bright or dense, right? If you wanted to paint it big, you'd have to really spread it out, so it might make it fainter. And the same thing goes. When you magnify the light of a distant object, you're spreading that light over a larger region, which makes it less faint, well, less bright, right? And so this is why on really cheap telescopes, they'll just advertise stuff as magnification. They'll just say, this is a really high magnification telescope. And that's not really what you want to look for. Because if it's really, really, really high magnification, like 600 magnification, you're going to see garbage, nothing. You're just going to see nothing. It will look awful, blurry mess. It'll be, and so don't just chase magnification. You want to essentially think, I want the largest aperture with the best, glass with, like the best mount, right? But if you go for a 4, 5, or 6 inch aperture, you're going to do pretty well for yourself. Even if you can't afford a 10 inch aperture, you're going to do pretty well for yourself, right? The other thing is maybe you don't want to buy the biggest aperture, because if a 10 inch telescope is not something you can just throw into a backpack, that you need like a full giant case. Those are really big and bulky. And so if it's something that you're not wanting to transport to other places, then you just want to live in your backyard, then maybe you want to get one of those. But these are things you have to think about. How do you want to move this thing around? Do you just want to store this someplace? Keeping it out all the time means it gets dusty. Dusting a telescope sucks. It's really bad. And so if you want something that is more portable, you might want to go for a 4, 5, or 6 inch one. Maybe a Schmidt Cassegrain that's even more compact that can fit inside some sort of case. Because there are cases that people make that allow you to take and transport telescopes on planes. So you could take this and visit other parts of the country, other parts of the world, which is pretty cool. When it comes to magnification, magnification is defined based on the ratio between something called the focal length of the primary focusing element, the mirror or the refractor, divided by the focal length of the eyepiece that you're using. So let's go back to this. That's a complicated thing that I just said. Let's go back to this. So focal length is defined essentially, in this case, if I advance this, you can see the length between here and where it focuses to a point. That's the focal length, right? Similarly, it'd be the distance between here and where it focuses to a point, which is up here, right? Not this distance, but if you were to have this mirror go away, it would focus back over to this spot right there. That would be the focal length of the telescope, right? Similarly, this right compound telescope has a focal length that's pretty long also, because it's here all the way over here and then back and all the way down and up to here. This is the focal length. This compound telescope takes a focal length that would be really long. You need a really long tube and bounces things back and forth to make the focal length, make the whole telescope smaller at a larger focal length. So that focal length is a property of the lens that you're using. If you're using a lens that focuses things to a shorter focal length, but in this case you're using a lens that focuses things to a longer focal length. And if you take the focal length of this primary and the focal length of this, because this also has a focal length as well, it's just defocusing the light. If you take those two focal lengths and divide them, you'll get the magnification, right? And so the magnification is, and so if I bring up, like this thing I was just showing, gosh, where can I? Let's go back to, let's do this. So we've got the moon here. Now if I do this, and whoops, that's not what I wanted. I want to go back to here, click on this. If we zoom out, you could imagine magnifying, but if you magnify too much, the object's light gets fainter and fainter, right? So you magnify and it's really hard to see, right? And it's blurry as heck, okay? And so this is the thing that you have to watch out for, especially because bad glass means you get it magnified, but you'll never be able to focus really well. There's an entire knob that slowly moves the eyepiece in and out, the other mirror, other focusing element on your eyepiece in and out to try and focus as best as it can, right? But you'd love it if you had a really, if you could magnify super well. But even if I magnify with this, it's pretty blurry as I magnify closer and closer, and it's not getting nearly as faint. So the rule of thumb is that for a telescope, the most useful top magnification, I don't know why this is happening, let's put this like that. The most useful top magnification you can ever get is about twice the aperture size in the millimeters. So if you have an aperture of, as we were talking about earlier, of something like 70 millimeters, so this would be a 2.8 inch telescope, a 70 millimeter telescope, the top magnification you could probably get without it getting blurry, being a blurry mess, is only 140, right? it's also 5 times the magnification in inches. So if you only know your telescope's, it's 5 times the aperture size in inches. So if you only know the telescope's aperture size in inches, take and multiply that by 5, and you'll end up getting, 50 times, and you'll end up getting the magnification that matters there. But in this case, if you go beyond that, everything's going to be a blurry mess, right? So if you go to some sort of store and you see a cheap telescope and it's like, 300 times magnification power. 300 times magnification power for a telescope, not going to be great. And to find, the focal length, look on the side of the telescope. Look what it says for the focal length. Generally, they'll say like F and then a number for the focal length, right? Or they'll tell you the aperture size, and they'll say, here's the aperture size of this telescope. And say, okay, well, that aperture size, I know what it is in inches, so I multiply that by 50. I know what it is in millimeters, so I multiply that by 2. And then I go, you know what? Even though they say that it's got 600 times power, 300 times power, it's not going to be good. I don't want to do that, right? Keep shopping at that point, okay? So for most objects, you're going to want to get a magnification, generally for your objects, between 8 and 40 times per inch of your aperture, right? So you're not going to go to 50, because 50 is the absolute top. Generally, you're going to go 8 to 40 times per inch. So if you've got a 3-inch telescope, you're going to want to go to 8 times 3, a 24 times magnification, or 40 times 3, 120 times magnification. That's generally what you're going to want to do for a 3-inch telescope, right? For that 6-inch telescope, you could double it. 6 times 8 is what? I always screw this up. 6 times 8 is 56. 54. It's 54 times magnification, or up to 40 times 6, 240 times magnification. So that's generally the range you're going to want to look for, right? And to figure that out, again, all you need to do is take and divide. The magnification is the focal length of the main focusing element divided by the focal length of the eyepiece, right? And so when you buy a telescope, it'll come with a couple eyepieces, and they'll tell you the focal length. There'll be like an F on the side, and what you have to do is you go, okay, well, the focal length of the telescope, which is printed on the telescope, printed in the packaging for the telescope, divide that by the eyepiece focal length. That'll tell you the magnification, and you go, okay, that was probably a pretty good one to look at. For all of this might just be going in an ear and out another. Totally fine. There's many guides online for this, but mostly what's the take-home message is you're going to want to buy a telescope, and you want to think about what your magnification is. Try not to over-magnify, because it'll just make everything into a blurry mess, okay? And so you'll also be able to buy eyepieces, and for some telescopes, they'll only fit one type of eyepiece, and you go buy other eyepieces, and you go, this eyepiece, and like the eyepiece will be sold as like 32 millimeter eyepiece, and that'll be the focal length is 32 millimeter, right? Because generally they'll all have the same size aperture, because it'll be either one of two sizes, 1.5 inches or 2 inches. Some telescopes will take both 2 inches and 1.5 inches, but most just it's 1.5 inches, and you go, okay, that's how big it is, but they'll be listed based on their focal length, so that you can do that magnification calculation, right? And so you'll know that if the focal length is smaller, the magnification is larger, because remember, the magnification is the focal length of the telescope divided by the focal length of the eyepiece. So if the eyepiece focal length is smaller, that makes the magnification larger, right? So these are the things to be thinking about, okay? There's another number that you sometimes see, and it's the focal ratio, which is the focal length of the telescope divided by the size of the aperture. And I don't want to get into that. It mostly has to do with it's a way that people have talked about taking film in terms of your aperture size and the focal length of the camera. Of the lens, I don't want to get too deep into focal ratio, because there's a lot of stuff there, but I can put links in the chat here, or in the video comments, or with the description, for exactly how you can read more about this. But for right now, because it's already 3:48, I don't want to get too much into that. So let's imagine that you've bought a 6-inch telescope. You were like, you know what, this is the one that I can buy. I want to buy one that's, you've decided on a 6-inch telescope. You want to buy one that's maybe a Schmidt-Cassegrain, so a compound style telescope where the light comes in and out. You know your eyepiece that you want. What else is there to consider? Well, there's also the type of mount that the telescope has, right? So if I turn this on right here, there are 2 primary mounts that a telescope can have. Whoa, that's really big. Let's bring this back here, turn this on like this. This should be much smaller. There's a mount called an alt-az mount, or alt-azimuth, altitude azimuth, and there's an equatorial mount, which is a special case of this alt-az. Alt-Az mounts are just your typical tripod, which means that the telescope sits there and you can change how it looks up and down and how it turns around. Because azimuth is the direction in this, the degrees around in this direction, and altitude is up from the horizon. So altitude, azimuth, right? And that's just what a tripod does. You have a tripod with a camera, you can turn it left and right and then tilt it back to look up and look down, right? Although telescopes generally don't look down. So in this case, you can see on this picture here that it's got it's got this, which allows it to go this way, and then it's got this one right here, which allows it to go up and down, right? And there are knobs generally on these. This right here is the focusing knob for this refracting telescope, which allows this whole thing to move in and out to focus what you're looking at. There are knobs on these, and those knobs allow you, like the knob down here and probably a knob under here or whatever, that allow you to slowly turn it, and it slowly moves this telescope up and down and around, right? Most tripods don't have those, but telescope tripods do. And you want to make sure when you get a tripod for your telescope that it's not flimsy at all, because you don't want to be looking through it, knock it, and get everything out of whack, and also like have it shake and continue shaking. You want it pretty strong, especially because these telescopes can be pretty heavy, right? The other type of telescope mount is called an equatorial mount. And what that is it's a mount where it's also altitude azimuth, but it's tilted up such that this part right here points towards the North Star. And you can slowly rotate, there's like a knob down here on this that allows you to slowly rotate it so that it points up there. And then you turn the whole dang tripod so it points north-south and then it's tilted up this way. Why would you care about that? Well, as we've talked about, the stars, just like the sun, rise in the east and set in the west. So remember how when I was looking at, if I go back to my space engine here, if I go back to Stellarium here, so if I turn off the internet here, if we look at an object in Stellarium, like let's look at Jupiter. We were just talking about this. Whoops, turning on a bunch of lines whoops, that's what I do. As I look through, if I focus my telescope on there and focus, look at this thing. Look at it motoring. So imagine you've got a telescope that's like this. You're going to look at this, like through this, you've got this in your eyepiece and you're looking, and it's just slowly moving. Why? Because the Earth is rotating. So the planet is also moving, which means you're going to want to hopefully track this object as it moves across the sky if you want to look at it for a long period of time, right? Otherwise, you're going to have to continually find it. It's a real pain in the butt. So to do that, well, that's why they include these knobs, right? These knobs on the telescope to do that. But with an Alt-Az telescope, you're going to have to move the two knobs and hope you know which way it's going and follow it and track it, as it moves up. With an equatorial mount, it's mounted in a specific way that there's just one knob you have to turn. And that knob just tracks across the sky. So the telescope is mounted so that it knows which way is around the sky and it just follows around the sky, which is pretty cool, right? So that is the equatorial mount. And those are a little bit more cumbersome. It's a little bit harder to set them up so that they, work the correct way so that, it's set up and pointed towards the North Star. Some of them have like a little eyepiece that you can look at to put the North Star in there and stuff. Others don't. There's a third type of mount, which is called a go-to mount. And those are mounts that have a robotic thing where your telescope, actually there's a third type of mount called a Dobsonian mount. And a Dobsonian mount looks like, so let's see here, you got this. This is a person with a Dobsonian mount, and you can see the Dobsonian mount is kind of like a specialized altitude azimuth one, except it's mounted on the ground. This is maybe your classic. If you could afford a telescope like this, where it's a reflecting telescope, you've got the mirror there on a Dobsonian mount, buy one of these. They're, I think, best bang for your buck. There's also telescopes, that have this here right here has like these arms around it, so it's kind of very similar to the Dobsonian. But there's also go-to mounts, like this one right here, this go-to mount, which has a robotic, you just like a little thing, you just program it in and it just points to the telescope. So it's like an altitude azimuth or a Dobsonian mount, but it moves on its own and points and then tracks, which is really great. The problem is setting those up when you're out in the field is pretty complicated. So, in terms of cheapness, you're probably first types of telescopes are these Dobsonian Newtonian reflectors. Newtonian reflector, because Isaac Newton was the first person to come up with this type of reflector, which puts the eyepiece here so that you can sit in a chair and look at the telescope, which is really nice, right? This person is programmed, has one where apparently it's got a go-to mount in there as well that does what we call tracking, which tracks the sky, right? So once you have everything set up, you've found the right mount, you've got it out there, you also have to watch out for the fact that some nights are better than other nights for looking at the stars, right? I should also point out that there's another thing that you might have to worry about, which is finding the actual objects. If you look through a telescope, and even if it's focused, you're going to see a chunk of sky that's really, really tiny, right? It'd be like trying to find a specific speck on my shirt here, and you're only seeing a spot that's like really tiny. It's going to be really hard to find it. You don't even know if you're in the right area of the sky. That's why these finder scopes exist. They just like mounted to the side. They offer a larger field, not nearly as magnified, and they're kind of like a mini telescope. And what you do is you start by like pointing the whole telescope at something on the horizon that you can find through the eyepiece of the actual telescope, and then you twiddle the finder until it's also pointing there, which means that when you look up in the sky, you can look through the finder to find the thing in a larger region and go, okay, now I'm kind of pointed where I need to go. And then when you look through the regular telescope, it should be pointed right where you are, right? There's also ones that are red dot finders, which are kind of like, you know, on a like a gun. They use a laser sight to help the process. I've never used a red dot finder. I've always used just enlarging finders, which are your classic. Finder scopes often come with the telescope, and they're garbage. You can always buy and mount other finder scopes. They're pretty helpful. They're really, really helpful. But now you're in the spot, you're out there, you're looking, you know, through the telescope, but you're probably noticing in your first time looking at a telescope, and you're looking at the moon, which is a classic thing to look at through a telescope, that you can't really get it focused. And in fact, it looks a little bit wonky, like this. Can you all see that what's going on here? This is the biggest annoyance for telescopes on the ground, which is that the Earth's atmosphere actually acts to blur the light and make it really fuzzy. And it changes every second because the atmosphere is turbulent. Air is moving through the atmosphere, and it's kicking this turbulence up, which makes it look like you're looking in a desert through desert heat rising. It's a very similar effect. This turbulence is annoying. Astronomers call it seeing, and even this, it makes everything look a little wavy. So the best times to observe with a telescope are nights where the moon is relatively not full, so it's dark, where the air is incredibly still, where it's not too hot, where the hot air is rising such that even if the air is still where you are, the hot air is not being turbulent in the atmosphere. This is tough. And there are websites, if I look up Kitt Peak Clear Sky Chart, I go to the Kitt Peak Clear Sky Chart here. There's a set of websites like the Kitt Peak Clear Sky Chart. So if I, actually here, let's just do this. I have two internet things open so that I can turn it on here. Boom. This is the Kitt Peak Clear Sky Chart, and this is a prediction of how much cloud cover is going to be over the site, which is the top row here. Whoops. How much transparency, so how well you can see through clouds. What's the seeing, which I was saying, and then what's the darkness. So the darkness will be these dark blue spots, dark blue, that's when it's dark, right? And so you can see that generally the seeing is not great. Otherwise it would be darker right now. So for some reason the seeing is not great. It's because it's incredibly windy out where I live. You can see the wind is pretty high, but when the wind gets, the seeing gets better when the wind goes down, the darker colors down here. And also there's some clouds that are about to come up over, on Monday. So you can use this to kind of say, all right, am I going to get some clouds right now? Am I going to get good seeing by looking for a clear sky chart near where you live, right? And so there's a whole description down here. And you can find these for all sorts of sites around America. And in fact, the world. But that's one way of doing it. But once you found that, there's a lot of things going on in terms of, like looking to see what type of objects do you want to look at? How do you find them, right? And then also what type of magnification are you going to be able to see this? My recommendation is when you start with a telescope, look at the moon. The moon's really easy to find through the telescope. It's really easy to focus on the moon. You can see a lot of craters. Looking for craters near the edge of the moon is like pretty cool to look at. I think the moon is your classic first thing. But then there's lots of other things that are pretty awesome. The Ring Nebula is pretty incredible to look at. I always recommend Andromeda, but you have to watch out. So if we look here, this is a picture of Andromeda through a pretty amazing telescope right here. But with a 2.8-inch telescope at 30 times magnification in a rural sky, it's going to look like this, right? You'll see the core, the bright part of the center. You might see some fuzziness around it, but you won't nearly see as beautiful as this. But in a place where it's like a suburb, where I live right here, typical, you're just going to see the core and maybe the brightest part of the center. Not super exciting. So you got to make sure it's dark. You got to make sure the air is still. You got to make sure you bring all the stuff, your little red light flashlight or red light headlamp, so you don't ruin your night vision. You got to make sure that if you don't have a go-to mount that allows you to just go right to the objects, that you've got your sky map, that you've got your, your book with some other sky charts that you're familiar with the night sky to know where to find these things in general. So you can go, okay, I know it should be between these stars and point there and look through the finder scope. And that's really complicated, right? But the main thing I want you to know in the last couple minutes of this broadcast is that telescopes are going to be expensive. You should try and buy one that's large enough that you can afford it, but not, to the detriment of the other aspects of the telescope. When you're looking through a telescope, maybe you go to a store and buy one and ask someone, hey, here's how much money I have to spend. I want to buy something. I don't really need something that's got a robotic mount. I'd love something with maybe a Dobsonian mount, something that I could sit down. There's also ones that sit on a table, which is really nice because then it's already up a little bit, and it, like a little Dobsonian mount on a table. You can put the chair next to that. These are the things you want to start thinking about. There are some websites. Wirecutter has, actually, let's go over to the other one here. Wirecutter has a set of telescopes that, when people absolutely need to find a telescope, I say, all right, well, here's, this one right here, the Celestron Nexstar, right? If I click on it, it'll take me to an Amazon page, I think. It'll take me to the Best Buy page. This is a Schmidt-Cassegrain. It's also a go-to mount. That's what this robotic thing here is. If we go back, it's no longer available, which is a bummer. But if I click on Amazon, we can see how big it is. You can see that it's a 5-inch primary mirror, pretty classic. It's $890. It's like a $900 telescope with this go-to mount. You can see it's got a red dot finder here. It's got a couple more, there's also an 8-inch version, I think. This is the 8-inch primary mirror, which is a little bit larger, but that's all almost more than twice as much, right? So this is the thing, right? These are all computerized, so they make life a lot easier. If you don't want to spend that much, their next best bet is this Astronomers Without Borders One Sky telescope. This sits on a table, right? It's on back order, but it's only $200, right? Pretty nice. What's its aperture size? If we click on, if we read the review here on this Sky and Telescope, it's a 5-inch reflector. So it's also a 5-inch reflecting telescope. This secondary mirror needs to be really well calibrated to reflect this, but $200 for this thing, pretty good. You're not going to have the robotic thing. It's altitude azimuth, so it's going to be a little bit complicated to set up and track something. But for, and this is also, it says incomplete baffling. It doesn't cover all this way, so stray light can kind of sneak into this tube, which is not great. But as a $500 telescope, pretty good, right? There's another, this is a $640 Dobsonian right here. That's also pretty good, easy to use. It's an 8-inch aperture, so it's pretty big. And for only $639, pretty nice, right? But it doesn't have the robotic mount, and it's also one that sits on the on a table. But these are kind of some good introductory ones, but you're gonna have to spend some money, okay? So it's now been an hour. I've been yammering on. I hope that I didn't talk too much. If you have questions, post them in the chat here, or post them on the comment section for the YouTube video. I really appreciate any comments people have. But I do encourage people, go out and look at telescopes. Don't buy a $70 telescope. Look at this garbage telescope they're advertising here. Look at this thing. This is a $70 telescope that is just going to be a garbage telescope for you, right? It's a 70mm telescope, and I bet that they're offering eyepieces on here that are just going to be not great, right? It's nice that they've got some good ratings there, but you can buy ratings. Anyway, don't buy a $70 telescope. Spend some money, or save some money and buy it. Thank you, Kevin Nguyen. I'm glad I could recommend some telescopes. I think that, once that Astronomers Without Borders telescope comes off of back order after COVID, I think that's a pretty good one that I would recommend because it teaches you a little bit about it. And I think anytime you're doing things more manually and not just assuming a robot can help you, the better. Otherwise, have a nice afternoon or evening. Go out and look at the stars. Put it in the comment if you actually do it. And I'll talk with you next month. Bye, everybody. So now I do the thing where I do every week stream where I just yammer on for a little bit until I see myself waving. And then I can end the stream for real. Because there's always a little gap here. And if you're seeing this part, I apologize for you seeing this part. This is always the sneaky thing at the very end. All right, there we go. Ending the stream.